The first sign that her marriage would not be normal came when the Duke's wedding gift arrived. It was a locked wooden trunk. 3 footmen carried it into her family's drawing room as if it contained either gold or a body. Her mother nearly fainted. Her father suddenly found the fireplace extremely interesting, and she just stood there, staring at the brass lock, wondering what sort of man sent a locked trunk to a woman before marrying her. Then the housekeeper opened the envelope attached to it and read the Duke's instruction aloud. The bride is not to open this until after the wedding ceremony. That was when she knew two things. First, her family had truly reached the bottom of poverty. And second, whatever strange fantasies the Duke was famous for, she was now included in them. By sunset, the whole house had developed opinions. And the bride, who had been raised to smile through discomfort, looked at that trunk and thought one very honest thing. If there is a whip inside, I am climbing out the chapel window. But the shocking part was not the trunk. The shocking part was what happened on the wedding night, when the Duke finally opened it himself. Inside was a key, and that key opened the first door to a secret so large it would change her marriage, his estate, and the lives of everyone hidden behind his walls. But before that trunk was opened, before the Duke became her husband, and before she learned the truth about his so-called fantasies, she had to survive the most humiliating morning of her life. The morning her parents told her she was being married off to save the family from ruin. Before that locked trunk is opened, do one small thing for me. If you're enjoying the story already, hit the subscribe button now and tell me in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. It helps more than you know. Now, let's go back to the morning her parents sold her future. The drawing room on Hargrove Street in London smelled, that morning in late September 1883, of old upholstery and stronger than usual tea. Francesca Vance sat in the armchair nearest the window. She was 22 years old, dark-haired, with a particular set to her jaw that her mother had always called stubborn and her late grandmother had always called sensible. She had been asked to come downstairs before breakfast, which was never a good sign. Her father stood near the mantelpiece. He was 51 and had the look of a man who had once been comfortable and was still pretending to be. His coat needed pressing. His watch chain was gone. Francesca had not mentioned the watch chain. Her mother sat very upright on the settee with both hands folded in her lap. Alma Vance folded her hands like that only when she needed to stop them from trembling. "We have something to discuss," her father said. "I gathered that," Francesca said. George Vance cleared his throat. "The situation with our finances has reached a point where, that is to say, the creditors have become we have received." "George," her mother said quietly. He stopped. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at his daughter. "We owe approximately £42,000 across 6 creditors," he said. "The townhouse is mortgaged. The account at Barclays is empty. Mr. Harvey has filed papers regarding the furniture. We have perhaps 60 days before we are in the street." Francesca kept her face still. She had suspected this. She had suspected this for 2 years. She had done the arithmetic herself, quietly, in the back pages of her personal diary, and come up with a number not far from 42,000. "All right," she said. "An offer has come," her mother said. "A serious offer. From a very significant party." "Who?" "His Grace, Blake Stafford," her father said. "The Duke of Ashford." Francesca looked at her father. Then she looked at her mother. Then she looked at the floor for a moment, because she needed somewhere neutral to look while she organized her thoughts. Blake Stafford, the Duke of Ashford, was known throughout every drawing room, country house, and gentleman's club in England. Not for the reasons most dukes were known. Not for gambling debts or political scandal or a famous mistress. The Duke of Ashford was known because nobody could explain him. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a fortune so large that even the most conservative estimates put it above £1 million. He owned a primary seat, Ashford Hall, somewhere in the north of Yorkshire. He also owned 2 other properties, for London addresses, and a substantial interest in a railway company based in Manchester. He should have been the most sought-after man in England. Instead, people whispered about him. They whispered about the locked wings of his estate, about servants who left his employment without explaining why, about deliveries that arrived after midnight, about his refusal to attend most social engagements, about the rules, the odd, specific, unexplained rules that anyone entering his employ was reportedly required to follow. Most of all, they whispered about his fantasies. Nobody could agree on what those fantasies were. Lord Malcolm Terry, who claimed to have dined at Ashford Hall 7 years ago, described seeing cages. He was vague about what was in the cages. Lady Edison Palmer's second cousin said the Duke kept strange people on the property. She said it exactly like that, strange people, and refused to be pressed further. A stable hand named Joel, who had briefly worked at Ashford Hall before leaving without notice, had told someone who told someone else that the sound in the East Wing at night was unlike anything he had heard before, and he had grown up near a slaughterhouse. Every story was different. Every witness claimed something unique. Francesca had heard them all. She had collected them the way one collects bad news, not seeking it out, but unable to stop it from arriving. He has made a formal offer, her mother was saying. His solicitor met with your father last Thursday. The settlement is, George, tell her the settlement. £30,000, her father said, paid immediately upon the marriage. The remaining £12,000 to follow within 6 months. Full assumption of our existing debts. Francesca stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at Hargrove Street. A cab was passing. A woman across the road was sweeping her front step with great energy. A small dog was investigating the base of a lamp post. Everything outside looked completely ordinary. He wants to marry me, she said. He has made a formal offer, her father corrected, which was not the same thing at all. She turned around. Why? Why me specifically? There are 40 women in this city with better connections, better prospects, better. His solicitor did not elaborate on his reasons, her father said. Her mother's hands tightened in her lap. Francesca, I want you to understand that we have not made this decision lightly. If there were any other way. There isn't, Francesca said. She did not say it bitterly. She said it as a fact. She had already known there wasn't. That was why it landed so calmly, like a stone dropped into still water. You could see the ripples, but the stone was already at the bottom. You don't have to decide today, her father said. Yes, I do, she said. We both know I do. George Vance stared at his daughter for a moment. Then he looked away. His shoulders dropped slightly, and in that small movement, Francesca saw the particular defeat of a man who knows he has failed someone and cannot undo it. She married Blake Stafford, the Duke of Ashford, on the 4th of October, 1883. The weeks between the announcement and the wedding were the strangest of her life. The marriage contract arrived via solicitor, 12 pages long, dense with conditions she had never encountered in any other marriage settlement she had seen. Certain areas of Ashford Hall were designated as restricted. Household staff were employed directly by the Duke and could not be dismissed or reassigned without his written consent. Guests required the Duke's prior approval. The east and north wings of the main house were listed as permanently closed to non-authorized persons, with authorization to be granted solely at the Duke's discretion. She read it 3 times. She asked Mr. Bowman, the family butler, if the contract seemed unusual. Mr. Bowman read it once, set it down, and said, Madam, I have been in service for 30 years, and I have never seen a marriage contract that required the bride to avoid 3 wings of a house. That was not encouraging. She wrote to her school friend Alice Warren in Bath, who wrote back immediately. Francesca, everyone says he is peculiar. You must find out what is in those wings. Promise me you will find out. She did not promise. She thought about the cages Lord Malcolm Terry had mentioned and decided she would cross that bridge when she reached it, possibly while climbing out a window. The day before the wedding, she received a note. One line, in a clean, angular handwriting she did not recognize. "You will not be harmed." B.S. She read it 4 times. She could not decide whether it was reassuring or the most alarming thing she had ever received. She went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, tapping the heel of her right hand against the mattress in a steady, methodical beat, counting the things she did not know about the man she was marrying. She ran out of fingers before she ran out of unknowns. The ceremony took place at St. Bartholomew's on Whitfield Lane, a church that seated 200 and was attended by approximately 40. The Vance family friends who appeared did so out of loyalty, not excitement. The Duke's side of the church was occupied by a small group of people Francesca did not recognize, quiet, soberly dressed, none of whom she was introduced to before the service began. Blake Stafford, the Duke of Ashford, was waiting at the altar when she walked in. Francesca had prepared herself, carefully, to be unimpressed. She was, immediately, completely unprepared. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair and a face that would have been described, in any other context, as straightforwardly handsome. He stood very still. He watched her walk toward him with an expression so carefully neutral that it communicated nothing whatsoever, which Francesca later decided was, itself, a kind of information. He was not the eccentric, wild-eyed figure she had assembled in her imagination over 6 weeks. He looked like a man at a business meeting, a very formal business meeting. He said his vows in a clear, measured voice. He placed the ring on her finger with the same economy of motion he appeared to apply to everything. When the minister pronounced them married, he turned and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them smiled. The wedding breakfast was held at a rented room in the Langham Hotel on Portland Place. 42 guests ate roasted pheasant and the most aggressively correct food Francesca had ever tasted. Blake Stafford sat beside her. He spoke when spoken to. He was polite. He asked if she needed more water twice. He answered 3 questions from her father's colleague with exactly the right amount of brevity. He did not speak to her directly until the coach arrived to take them north. They were settled inside, the city beginning to blur past the windows, when he turned and looked at her with the same neutral expression he had worn since the altar. "I suspect," he said, "that you have been given a very poor account of me." Francesca looked at him. "I have been given several accounts," she said. None of them agreed with each other. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like the edge of one, quickly contained. "None of them would," he said. She waited for him to say more. He looked back out the window. She looked at her hands. This, she thought, is going to be an extraordinarily long winter. They arrived at Ashford Hall, Yorkshire, late the following afternoon. She had not slept on the overnight train. She had sat very upright in the private compartment and listened to the sound of the train and pretended to read a novel she retained nothing of. Ashford Hall sat at the end of a long gravel drive, flanked by old oaks. It was enormous, significantly larger than she had imagined from its description. 4 stories of dark stone with what appeared to be at least 3 separate wings extending behind the central block. Several of the upper windows were shuttered. One entire wing to the north was completely dark. The staff was assembled on the steps. 14 servants she was introduced to in rapid succession. The housekeeper, Mrs. Sloane, the head footman, Lewis, the cook, whose name she immediately forgot and spent the next 3 months calling Mrs. Cook internally, the groundskeeper, assorted housemaids, 2 grooms. Blake stood slightly apart from her during the introductions, which made the whole thing feel less like arriving at her new home and more like being processed through a toll gate. Her rooms were in the south wing, well appointed, freshly prepared, with a fire already burning. Mrs. Sloane showed her around with crisp efficiency. "Is there anything Her Grace requires?" Mrs. Sloane asked. Answers, Francesca thought. "Not at present," she said. She dined with Blake that evening at opposite ends of a table that could have seated 30. The food was excellent. He asked her twice if the wine was to her satisfaction. She asked him about the grounds, which he described briefly. She asked about the village at the base of the hill, Ashford Vale, and he told her a small amount about its history and economy. He did not mention the north wing. He did not mention the east wing. He did not mention the locked trunk, which had arrived that morning and sat in her dressing room. After dinner, they retired separately, which was not unusual for the period but felt, given the circumstances, more loaded with significance than it should have. She was sitting at her dressing table at 10:30 when the knock came. She turned. Blake Stafford stood in the doorway between their rooms, which she had not previously noticed existed. He was still dressed, but without his coat. He held something in his right hand, small, metal, catching the lamplight. A key. I have something to show you, he said. She looked at the key. She looked at him. She did not move. Before anything else happens tonight, he said, there is something you need to understand about this house. About why the north wing is closed. About where I spend my time. He paused. I know that you are afraid. I would rather you were not. And the only way to address that is to show you the truth. She stood up. Does she trust him? She thought, almost as though someone were narrating her life. The answer was, no, not remotely. She had known this man for 2 days. He had the emotional accessibility of a granite escarpment. But she followed him anyway, because the note had said you will not be harmed, and because she had not come this far by being entirely without courage. He led her out of her rooms, down a corridor she recognized, then through a door that appeared to be a panel in the wall. She pressed her hand against it afterward and still could not find the seam. Behind it was a passageway, narrow and lit by small oil lanterns set into the wall. The air was cooler here, and the sound of the main house disappeared almost immediately. They walked for perhaps 10 minutes. The passage turned, descended 2 short flights of stairs, branched, and eventually emerged through another hidden door into a room Francesca could not immediately understand. It was large, very large, larger than the main hall, and it was full of people. Not crowded, not chaotic, but there were people everywhere she looked. Children sitting at low tables with books. Women working at something she couldn't immediately identify. A man reading near a window. 2 older men playing chess in the corner. A young boy asleep on a bench, covered with a woolen blanket. The space smelled of cooked food and lamp oil, and something she took a moment to identify. Safety. It smelled like a place people felt safe. She turned to look at her husband. Blake Stafford was watching her face. For the first time since she had met him, the neutral expression was gone. He looked like someone waiting for a verdict. How many people? She asked. At present, he said, 163. They arrive when they have nowhere else to go. Families. Children with no parents. Veterans who can no longer work. Widows without income. People the workhouse would take and the city would ignore. He paused. I pay for it. I have paid for it for 7 years. The estate generates enough. This is what I do with the excess. She looked around the room. At the children. At the women. At the sleeping boy. This, she said slowly, is what everyone calls your fantasies. Something in his expression shifted. It was not quite wry, but it was close. The terminology, he said, has never pleased me. The locked doors, she said. The unusual deliveries. The servants who leave. Leave with additional income and the understanding that they must not speak about what happens inside the north wing, he said. Most of them agree readily. Some find it too difficult to keep the confidence and prefer to depart. I do not hold it against them. She was quiet for a long moment. A woman at one of the tables looked up, saw the Duke, and nodded with the quiet familiarity of someone who encountered her employer regularly. Blake nodded back. Why did you not simply tell me? Francesca asked. Because I needed to know first, he said, whether you were someone I could trust with it. And now, he looked at her steadily. You followed me through a wall at 11 at night in a house you've never been inside, he said. I think that's sufficient evidence. She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together instead. He showed her more of the wing that night, the dormitories, the schoolroom, the small kitchen that operated separately from the main house, the medical room staffed by a Dr. Richard Palmer who lived on the property and asked no questions that weren't his business. She did not sleep until nearly 3 in the morning. They returned to the main house in silence, through the wall, back through the hidden corridors. At the door to her rooms he paused. "I won't ask you to keep this secret," he said. "Only to consider, before you tell anyone, what would happen to them." He meant the people in the wing, if the wrong person heard. "I understand," she said. She went to bed. He went to his rooms. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about 163 people living inside the walls of the house she had just moved into. The Duke of Ashford's Fantasies. She laughed, once, quietly, to herself, at the sheer improbability of it. 3 days later, their marriage was consummated. Francesca had been steeling herself for weeks for something she had no name for, building walls in advance of whatever was coming. Blake came to her door in the same measured manner he did everything, with no drama, no performance, and a question first. "Are you comfortable?" She thought about it. "Not entirely," she said honestly. "Tell me if that changes," he said. And then, quieter, "I will not rush you." He did not rush her. That was the simplest and most accurate thing she could say about it. He was patient in the way that careful, disciplined people are patient, not performing patience, but actually possessing it. And when it was over, she lay in the dark and felt, to her enormous confusion, not afraid. She felt, distantly, that she might have been wrong about several things. October gave way to November. Francesca Vance. She was Francesca Stafford now. Technically, though she practiced the name silently in the mirror for 2 weeks before it stopped sounding like someone else, spent her mornings in the North Wing. She had not been asked to. Blake had not suggested it. She had gone one morning because she could not stop thinking about the children at those low tables, and she had sat down next to a small girl named Chloe who was struggling with her letters, and she had stayed for 4 hours. After that, she went every morning. The people in the sanctuary were not, as she had half imagined, passive recipients of charity. They were busy. The women who were able ran the kitchen, organized the linen, mended clothing. The men who could work did various tasks around the grounds, paid fairly by the Duke's account. The older children taught the younger ones. Dr. Palmer ran a morning clinic 3 days a week. Blake moved through the wing like someone who had been doing this a long time, which he had. He knew people's names. He knew their situations. He spoke to people directly and listened when they answered. Francesca started keeping records. She had a systematic mind, and the wing needed better organization, and found that the filing was a disaster. Donations from anonymous sources were logged inconsistently. Expenditures were scattered across 3 separate ledgers. She spent 2 weeks reorganizing them. Blake found her one evening with papers spread across an entire table and looked at the scene for a moment. "You reorganized the supply ledger," he said. "And the donation records," she said, without looking up. "And the residential register. The previous system was going to cause a serious problem eventually." He was quiet. She looked up. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had first seen in the sanctuary on her wedding night, when she had turned and found him watching her face for a verdict. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "It's well done." She went back to the papers. He went back to his correspondence. But there was something in that moment, some small adjustment in the temperature between them, that she thought about afterward. Then, on a gray Friday morning in mid-November, the primary financial ledger for the sanctuary went missing. Mrs. Sloane discovered it first. Or rather, she discovered it was not where it should have been. The ledger, a thick green book, approximately 14 inches long, documenting incoming donations with corresponding donor information, had been removed from the locked cabinet in the records room. The cabinet itself had not been forced. Someone had used a key. Only 4 people had keys to that cabinet: Blake, Mrs. Sloane, Dr. Palmer, and Lewis, the head footman, who had been given one 3 years ago when Blake was traveling. Could it be mislaid? Francesca asked. "It has been in that cabinet for 11 months, Mrs. Sloane said, with the precise coldness of a woman who knew exactly where everything was at all times. Blake's face did not change when she told him, but his right hand, resting on the desk, curled very slowly into a fist. "Who has been in the records room in the last week?" he said. "3 housemaids, for cleaning. Dr. Palmer, yourself, and Her Grace." He looked at Francesca. "I last saw it on Wednesday," she said immediately. "I entered an expenditure at 2 in the afternoon and put it back." "I believe you," he said. He said it without hesitation. She had not realized, until that moment, how much it mattered to be believed without having to argue for it. The investigation began quietly. Blake did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone. He moved through the estate in his usual composed manner, asking questions, observing responses, noting small irregularities. He told Francesca, on the second evening, what was in the ledger. "The donor records are anonymous," he said, "but the format is traceable. Someone who understood how we coded entries could identify contributors. Several of them are respectable men with families. One is a member of parliament. If those names became public, it would destroy them," she said. "It would give someone leverage over them," he said. "Which is worse?" She sat with that for a moment. "And the residents? The people in the sanctuary?" "Full residential records are in a separate document. But the ledger contains enough to confirm the sanctuary exists, the approximate number of residents, and the general nature of it." He paused. "There are people in London who have been trying to find evidence of this operation for years." "Why?" "Because it interferes," he said, "with how they profit from poverty." She looked at him. "You mean workhouses?" "I mean the contracts that supply workhouses," he said. "The labor agreements. The land held by certain interests. The patronage networks." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. "Who has the ledger?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "But it is someone inside this house." That knowledge settled over the estate like a frost. Every conversation acquired a second layer. Every locked door felt newly suspicious. Francesca found herself watching faces, filing observations. She was not naturally suspicious, but she was naturally precise, and precision, right now, was necessary. She spent those evenings with Blake going over staff records, visitor logs, delivery histories. They sat on opposite sides of his study desk, papers between them, lamps burning, the house quiet around them. He explained things when she asked. She noticed things he had not, and said so. It was the first time they had spent sustained, unperformed time together. The first time they had simply been in the same room as two people with a problem to solve, rather than as a duke and a duchess negotiating a new shared territory. She noticed that he never interrupted her, that he had a habit of pressing 2 fingers to the edge of the desk when he was thinking hard, that he took his tea without sugar and drank exactly 1 cup per hour. She noticed that he noticed things about her too, the way his eyes would move to her face when she was speaking, with the quality of attention she associated with people who actually listened. December arrived. The investigation continued. They were no closer to identifying the thief, but they had ruled out Dr. Palmer, who had an unshakable alibi, and narrowed suspicion significantly. Blake had identified 2 likely candidates, Lewis, the head footman, and a newer household employee named Mrs. Terry, who had arrived 3 months prior with excellent references and slightly vague employment history. It was during the examination of Mrs. Terry's references that Blake made a remark so quiet and careful that Francesca very nearly missed it. "The agency that placed her," he said, setting the papers down. "It's the same agency that placed a man called Colton in my London house 4 years ago." Francesca looked up. "Colton." Blake was very still for a moment. Then he said, "A previous situation. It resolved badly." She waited. He picked the papers up again. "We should verify Mrs. Terry's previous employer directly. A letter tomorrow." "Blake." He looked at her. "What happened 4 years ago?" The lamp on the desk threw the room into a warm, fixed light. Outside, sleet was hitting the windows in small, regular intervals. The house was completely quiet except for the sleet and the sound of the fire. He set the papers down again. He looked at them, not at her. Her name was Violet, he said. I loved her. She died. He said it the way someone says something they have practiced saying simply so they can say it at all. What happened? Francesca said quietly. She was connected to the sanctuary. She knew about it. She was involved. She understood what it meant. Someone discovered that. Someone decided that removing her was the most effective way to frighten me into closing it. He paused. It happened very quickly. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already done. Francesca looked at him. His face was composed, completely composed, but his right hand was flat on the desk surface, pressing down, as though anchoring himself. Did they succeed? She asked. In frightening you. For approximately 6 months, he said. Then I decided that if I closed the sanctuary, she died for nothing. A pause. So I kept it open. She was quiet for a long time. This is why the cold, she thought. This is why the distance. This is why the note said you will not be harmed. Because he knows, specifically, what harm looks like when it comes for someone connected to him. You married me, she said slowly, knowing that whoever was responsible for Violet might eventually come after me. He looked at her then, directly. Yes, he said, which is why I want to know who took that ledger. And the contract, she said. The restrictions. The closed wings. The warnings about unauthorized guests. Every measure I could take, he said, to create distance between you and the sanctuary, while allowing us to. He stopped. He looked at the desk again. While still being married, she finished for him. Yes. Francesca stood up. She walked to the window, which showed her nothing but the reflection of the room, herself, the desk, the lamp, Blake sitting very still behind it. That was, she said carefully, a very well-intentioned and completely unworkable plan. A beat. Yes, he said again. Because I found the wing on our wedding night. I showed you the wing on our wedding night. You showed me because I was already frightened of worse things. She turned around. Did you consider simply telling me? I considered it, he said. I concluded that information held by more people creates more risk. You were trying to protect me, she said. I was trying not to repeat the same mistake twice. The sleet hit the window in a small burst. The fire snapped. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 11. She crossed the room and sat down on the near side of the desk, rather than returning to her own chair. Closer to him. Near enough that the distance between them, the careful, engineered, deliberate distance, became obviously artificial. I stopped being afraid of you, she said, approximately 4 days after I arrived. He looked at her. The children know you by name, she said. Chloe runs to you when she sees you in the wing. You know every resident's history. Dr. Palmer has worked for you for 11 years without a formal contract because he trusts you completely. She paused. I know what kind of man fears hurting people. I know what it looks like. Something broke through the composure then. Just briefly. Just enough. Francesca, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like the first honest thing either of them had said. She did not move away. Neither did he. What happened next was not desperate or performative. It was two people who had spent months maintaining the careful architecture of separateness and simply, in one quiet moment, letting it go. He put his hand over hers on the desk. She turned her hand over. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplit room, the sleet outside, the fire, the papers between them still holding their secret. Then they were no longer separated by the desk. After that night, the marriage was different. Not outwardly. They were still contained, still composed in company, still conducted themselves with the habits of people raised to keep emotion as a private matter. But privately, the distance was gone. The evenings in the study became something else. The meals at opposite ends of the table migrated, by unspoken agreement, closer together. He called her by her name. She began to understand his silences well enough to speak into them or respect them as the occasion required. She had not expected to like him. She was discovering that she did considerably more than that. The answer to the ledger came in January, and it came from a direction that hurt. Blake received a letter from a London solicitor, a firm Francesca did not recognize, but Blake clearly did, because his face went very still when he read it. The letter was a proposal, worded delicately, professionally, in the careful language of legal communication. It nonetheless said, at its core, surrender control of the sanctuary's finances, relocate the residents to county workhouse facilities, and the stolen ledger will not reach the newspapers. Blake read it twice. Set it down. Read it once more. Then he said, "It is Marcel." Francesca looked at him. "My cousin," he said. Marcel Stafford. Marcel Stafford was 43 years old, had been to Ashford Hall several times in the preceding years, and was, as Francesca had been given to understand, the nearest male relative the Duke possessed. He was, in the event of Blake dying without an heir, the next in the line for the title. "He has been managing this from London," Blake said. He was not raising his voice. He was extremely quiet, which was, she had learned, his version of the opposite. The placement of Mrs. Terry through the agency. The theft of the ledger. Very likely the situation with Colton 4 years ago. The air in the study was very still. "He was in this house," Blake said. "He has been in this house. He knows the layout. He knows the passages. He has sat at that table and eaten with us and asked about your health and—" He stopped. His right hand was flat on the desk, pressing down. "How long have you suspected him?" Francesca asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I did not allow myself to suspect him," he said. "He is family. I did not allow it." She understood that. She understood what it cost to say it. "He wants control of the estate," she said. "He has wanted the title since my father died," Blake said. "The sanctuary has always been what stood between us. If he could discredit me publicly, expose the sanctuary, create a scandal, force a legal dispute over the estate's expenditures, he could potentially challenge the inheritance through the courts. Could he succeed? With the ledger and the right judge and a narrative about financial mismanagement?" He picked up the letter. "Possibly. Then we need to take the narrative away from him," Francesca said. He looked at her. "He expects you to be alone in this," she said. "He expects to deal with a man trying to protect his secret quietly. He does not expect—" She gestured at herself in a way that was not without some dark humor. "An organized woman with very good filing." He looked at her for a moment. "The records I reorganized," she said. "Every legitimate transaction. Every donor correspondence. Every resident intake record. 11 months of documented evidence that this operation is charitable in nature and financially above reproach." She paused. "I can produce a complete account of the sanctuary's finances that would satisfy the most hostile parliamentary inquiry. He may still send the ledger to the newspapers." "Let him," she said. "A newspaper story about a duke secretly running a sanctuary for orphans and veterans is not the scandal he imagines it is. It is a significantly better story than the one about his cousin's financial manipulation and blackmail attempt." Blake stared at her. Then, with less composure than she had ever seen in him, he said, "Where have you been for the last 7 years?" She almost smiled. "Hargrove Street, looking at the fireplace." The next 3 weeks were the most demanding of Francesca's life. Working together with Blake, Dr. Palmer, and, crucially, Mr. Bowman, who had traveled north at her request and proved to possess an extraordinary memory for financial documentation, she assembled a comprehensive record of the sanctuary's existence, purpose, and funding. She wrote to 3 of the anonymous donors with Blake's authorization, explaining the threat and requesting written confirmation of their charitable intentions. 2 responded within the week. The third, the MP, responded with a letter that was essentially a legal declaration. Blake, simultaneously, hired an investigative firm in London that spent 10 days building a case against Marcel Stafford's manipulation of property records and misrepresentation of legal correspondence. Marcel received a letter of his own at the end of January. He did not respond. 3 days later, the firm in London reported that Marcel Stafford had departed for France. The ledger was recovered from Mrs. Terry's room during a methodical search. She had hidden it under the floorboards beneath her wardrobe, which was the least imaginative hiding place Francesca had ever encountered and which she did not say out loud because it seemed cruel. Mrs. Terry was dismissed. She was not prosecuted, because prosecution would have required explanations that would have generated the exact publicity Marcel had threatened, and because she was, on examination, a frightened woman who had been paid handsomely to do something she had not fully understood. Francesca arranged for a reference that described her as a competent domestic worker who had left employment under mutual agreement, which was not precisely accurate but was sufficient. Blake watched her do this. That was more generous than she deserved, he said. It was practical, Francesca said. It was both, he said. Which is better? The threat was gone. Marcel Stafford remained in France. His solicitors sent a withdrawal of all claims and a very quiet formal apology, which Blake read once and put in a drawer and never mentioned again. Blake shut himself in his study alone for one afternoon after it was over. Francesca did not intrude. She sat in the sanctuary with Chloe and 3 other children and helped them practice reading, and she thought about what it cost to be betrayed by someone you had chosen to trust. When he came out of the study that evening, she was at the top of the main stairs. He looked at her from the bottom. "I am all right," he said. "I know," she said. "You are also allowed to be not all right." He came up the stairs. He stopped on the step below hers. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for not standing behind me. I told you from the beginning," she said, "that I was not built for standing behind people." He took her hand. They went into dinner. By the spring of 1884, Ashford Hall had begun, almost imperceptibly, to change. It was not dramatic. Nothing about the process was dramatic. It happened the way that any genuine shift happens, in accumulated small moments, in habits forming, in the slow replacement of caution with something easier. Blake delegated differently now. He had always managed the sanctuary's operations with a kind of solitary intensity, carrying its details the way people carry things they are afraid to put down in case someone else sets them down in the wrong place. He began asking Francesca's opinion, not formally, not because protocol required it, because he actually wanted to know what she thought. They expanded the sanctuary's schoolroom in February. Francesca had identified, through her records work, that the older children, those between 12 and 16, were being significantly underserved by the existing curriculum. She proposed a structured apprenticeship arrangement with 3 local tradesmen in Ashford Vale. Blake approved it the same day she proposed it, which she noted, in the privacy of her own head, as possibly the fastest thing he had ever done. She also wrote to her father. George Vance was well, or as well as a man could be after being liberated from £42,000 of debt, and was living more simply, but with considerably less of the fixed expression of terror she had spent the last 2 years observing on his face. She invited her parents to visit in the spring. Blake agreed without being asked. Her mother arrived in April and spent the first hour walking around Ashford Hall with the expression of someone revising several previously held assumptions. At dinner on the second evening, Alma Vance watched her son-in-law listen to her daughter describe a logistical problem with the sanctuary's supply chain, and then watched him lean forward, chin in hand, working through the problem with her, and made a sound that was not quite a word. "He listens," Alma said to Francesca the next morning, very quietly, as though reporting something significant. "Yes," Francesca said. "Your father," Alma said, "has never once," she stopped. "Well, I'm very glad." It was, Francesca reflected, the most honest thing her mother had said to her in years. The spring also brought a discovery that would have, in an earlier season of their marriage, been a source of enormous tension. Blake, reviewing the household accounts with Francesca in April, found a discrepancy that he initially attributed to a clerical error. On examination, it was not a clerical error. It was a series of deliberate adjustments to Francesca's own household allowance, redirected, carefully, gradually, over the preceding 6 months, into the sanctuary's supply fund. He set the ledger down. She had known he would find it eventually. She had been slightly surprised it took until April. "You sold your grandmother's brooch," he said. He said it quietly. "It was assessed at £22, she said. The linen supplier in Leeds raised his prices in December, and the sanctuary's linen budget was." "Francesca." She met his eyes. "You sold your grandmother's brooch," he said again. Not as an accusation. As something else, something trying to understand itself. "I did not need the brooch," she said. "You also redirected your dress allowance for 3 months. I had sufficient dresses, and the funds your father sent at Christmas. We did not need." "Francesca." She stopped. He stood up. He walked around the desk to where she was sitting. He stood in front of her and looked at her for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "I would have." "I know you would have," she said. "That was not the point." "Then what was the point?" She thought about how to say it. "The point was that I wanted to contribute to something I believed in," she said. "Not because you asked. Not because I was supposed to. Because I chose to." She paused. "The sanctuary is not your project that I assist with. It is ours. I wanted my own stake in it." He was very still. "Her brooch," he said, almost to himself. £22. "It was a very nice brooch," she conceded. "But it sat in a box." He took her hand. He held it for a moment, and she felt, in the quality of that grip, something she could not name precisely. It was not gratitude, not entirely, and not affection, not only. It was the specific feeling of being seen completely and found not wanting. "I will replace the brooch," he said. "You absolutely will not," she said. "I will replace the brooch," he repeated, and there was something in his voice that made further argument impossible, so she let it go. He replaced the brooch 2 weeks later. He also had a lockbox installed in her study with her own key and a separate household fund account at the Yorkshire Bank, in her name, under her control, with no requirement to account to him for its use. She found the arrangement noted in a letter on her desk. At the bottom, in his angular handwriting, he had added, "Your grandmother's brooch was recovered at auction. It is in your jewelry case. B." She read it twice. She sat with it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her own drawer, next to a note that said, "You will not be harmed," which she had kept since the beginning. By that summer, there was laughter in the house. Real laughter, not the polite, social kind, but the helpless kind that people produce when something is genuinely, unexpectedly funny. Blake had a dry, precise wit that emerged, she discovered, in inverse proportion to how comfortable he felt in a situation. The more at ease he became, the sharper his humor. She had always been quick herself. The result, at meals, was occasionally chaotic in a way that shocked both of them the first few times it happened. "I did not expect you to be funny," he said one evening, with the tone of someone delivering a formal report. "I did not expect you to be funny either," she said. "I'm not sure I am," he said. "You made Dr. Palmer laughed so hard he spilled his wine last Thursday." That was factual observation. It was absolutely not. In September 1884, almost exactly 1 year after the locked trunk had arrived on Hargrove Street, Francesca discovered she was pregnant. She was in the sanctuary's schoolroom when the particular certainty arrived. She had been feeling unwell in the mornings for 2 weeks and had attributed it to various other causes with the same systematic denial she applied to most information she was not ready to process. The certainty, when it came, hit her as certainty always hits, not gradually, but all at once, in the middle of a completely ordinary moment, with the quality of a door opening. She sat very still in the schoolroom for approximately 5 minutes while Chloe worked on a sentence about a fox. Then she went to find her husband. She found him in the estate's north stable yard, talking to the groundskeeper about a drainage problem. He looked up when she appeared in the yard entrance. She did not say anything immediately. She walked toward him across the yard and looked at his face. He read something in hers. He had become very good at reading her face and said something to the groundskeeper, who departed. They were alone in the stable yard. "What is it?" he said. She said it plainly, because that was always the best way to say important things. "I am going to have a child." Blake Stafford, who had stood at his father's funeral at the age of 20 without visibly crying, who had received a letter blackmailing him over the sanctuary without a change in expression, who had sat across a study table from his wife discussing his former lover's death with composed, precise detail. Blake Stafford looked at his wife, and his face did something that she had not seen it do before. He went very still, not the composed stillness of someone managing their reactions. The still of someone who has just received information their body does not know what to do with. "Say that again," he said. "I am going to have a child," she said. He said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the stable yard, the worn cobblestones, the autumn sky, the fence at the far end, and she watched something move through his face that had no name she could identify. It was not joy exactly. It was something larger and rawer than joy. It was the expression of a man who had not allowed himself to imagine something and was now imagining it, for the first time, very fast. His hand found hers at his side. "Are you well?" he said. "I am quite well," she said. "The mornings are manageable. You should see Dr. Palmer." "I was planning to." He was still holding her hand. He was looking at her with that expression. "Blake," she said softly. "I did not think." He stopped. "Tried again. I had concluded, some time ago, that certain things were not, that they were not for me. Specifically." He paused. "I was wrong." She stepped closer. "You were," she said. He put his arm around her. She leaned against his side. They stood in the stable yard for a while, in the autumn light, while the house rose behind them and the sanctuary operated within its walls, and the groundskeeper did something diplomatic at the far end of the property. The months that followed were the happiest Ashford Hall had known in a very long time. Blake became, in increments, ridiculous. Not immediately. He was not the kind of man who could become immediately ridiculous, but gradually. He read. He ordered books on infant care from London and read them in his study, and emerged from them with the expression of someone who has encountered a field of study they had severely underestimated. He asked Dr. Palmer detailed questions at every available opportunity. He reorganized 2 rooms on the south corridor to create a nursery that was larger, warmer, and better positioned than strictly necessary. He installed a speaking tube between the nursery and the master bedroom, so sounds could carry. The speaking tube, Francesca said, when it was installed. "A practical measure," he said. "Blake, the acoustics in this wing are." "Blake, it is a speaking tube between the nursery and our bedroom." He looked at her with complete dignity. "Yes," he said, "it is." She kissed him on the cheek and did not say anything else because she did not want to undermine the dignity with which he was managing the whole business. Their son was born on a cold morning in April 1885. They named him George Edison Stafford, George for her father, who had, after all, tried his best, and Edison because Blake had a fondness for the name that he never quite explained and she never quite questioned. Blake was with her throughout. He held her hand. He said absolutely nothing useful and nothing harmful, which was, in the circumstances, the correct balance. When the child was placed in his arms, he looked down at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, in a voice he clearly believed was not loud enough for anyone else to hear, "Hello. I am your father. I have not done this before. I will do my best." Francesca, who heard him perfectly clearly, pressed her face against the pillow for a moment. She had not been expecting to feel what she felt. Not in this way, not this fully. She had expected to be fond of him. She had expected to be grateful for his decency and his patience and his dry humor and his inability to stop researching things he cared about. She had not expected to love him with the particular, unguarded completeness with which she found herself loving him. But there it was. The year that followed brought the sanctuary's most significant expansion. Blake, working with Francesca and Dr. Palmer and a solicitor in York named Kevin Walls, formalized the sanctuary's legal structure, not because it was legally required, but because it made the operation significantly more defensible. Donations were organized through a properly chartered charitable trust. The educational program was expanded. A small medical facility was established in the East Building, serving not only sanctuary residents but families from Ashford Vale and the surrounding villages. People in the region began to know what Ashford Hall was. Not everything, not the full details, but enough. The story that circulated was roughly accurate. The Duke of Ashford maintained a charitable establishment for vulnerable families. It was not a secret anymore. It was simply a fact about the estate, mentioned in the same breath as the quality of the land and the length of the drive. Nobody called it Fantasies anymore. There was a second child, a daughter, in 1887. Nicole Alma Stafford, with her grandmother's name and her father's eyes and a level of determination, apparent from approximately 4 months of age, that made both her parents look at each other with the specific expression of people who understand they are outmatched. Blake, navigating the particular challenges of fatherhood with a precision that would have been funny if it were not also endearing, developed a method for walking the nursery floor at 2 in the morning that he had clearly optimized over weeks. Specific steps, specific pace, specific turn radius. Francesca watched him from the doorway once, at 3 in the morning, and felt something that she later described to Alice Warren in a letter as the specific satisfaction of being exactly where you were supposed to be. In the autumn of 1888, 5 years after the locked trunk had arrived on Hargrove Street, Blake and Francesca walked together through the hidden passage into the sanctuary wing. The children were older. Some had left, trained, placed, equipped for lives outside. New ones had arrived. The schoolroom now had a blackboard and proper furniture and a teacher who was paid a full salary. The medical facility treated 200 patients a month from the surrounding area. Chloe, now 11, was reading aloud to a group of smaller children. She looked up when Blake appeared and waved at him with the total unself-consciousness of someone who had known him most of her life. Blake waved back. Francesca stood next to her husband in the doorway of the sanctuary, her hand in his. 5 years removed from the morning she had sat across from her parents and heard the word ruin. "I used to sit in the schoolroom and think," she said, "about the first time I walked in here. How strange it was. How nothing I expected turned out to be true." "Nothing I expected turned out to be true either," he said. She looked at him. "I expected," he said, "that I would live alone in this house until I died in it. That the sanctuary would survive me by perhaps 10 years. That I would leave a reasonable legacy." He paused. "I did not expect any of this." She squeezed his hand. "The trunk," she said. "I never asked what was in it. Other than the key." "Letters," he said. "Documents relating to the sanctuary. I wanted you to have them if something happened to me before the wedding night." She looked at him. "You were prepared for something to happen to you before the wedding night." "Marcel had been very active that autumn," he said. "I took precautions." She shook her head slowly. "You are the most methodical man I have ever encountered. You reorganized 11 months of financial records in a fortnight," he said. "You have no standing to comment on methodical." She laughed. He smiled. A real one. The kind he had, she had since learned, always possessed, and simply had no occasion to use. Around them, the sanctuary breathed and moved and lived. Children argued over books. A woman hung washing by the east window. Dr. Palmer passed through with his bag, nodding at them both. The whole place had the quality of an exhale, the deep, settled ease of a thing that has found its shape. What had begun as a forced marriage on a September morning when a family could not pay its debts had become the truest thing either of them had built. What had begun as fear had become the most reliable ground she had ever stood on. What had begun as duty had become, without either of them precisely noticing the moment of transition, love. The Duke of Ashford's so-called weird fantasies turned out to be the simplest thing in the world. He had wanted to build a home where no one felt abandoned. He had wanted a family that chose to be a family. He had wanted a partner who stayed not because the contract required it, but because the life they were building was worth staying for. He got all three. And the woman who had stood in her parents' drawing room staring at a locked trunk and thought, if there is a whip inside, I am climbing out the chapel window. That woman became the person who helped turn a lonely man's quiet mission into something that would outlast both of them. The trunk, for the record, sat in Francesca's study until the end of her life. She had the brass plate polished every year. She never locked it again. Inside, always, she kept two things: a note that said you will not be harmed, and her grandmother's brooch. This has been the story of Blake and Francesca Stafford, a locked trunk, a hidden wing, a secret that was never strange, and a marriage that became everything neither of them expected. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, subscribe. There are more stories where this came from. Same time next week.